Is the Sony a6700 the best hybrid APS-C camera that you can purchase today? Well, I've had it for a year now, and here is my long-term review. Maybe like you, I've been on a journey to find the perfect camera that fits my hybrid lifestyle. I shoot videos and I take photos all the time in every single different type of lighting environment that you can imagine, and I needed a camera that could keep up with that. If you ever want to find the intricacies of a camera, then go ahead and verse it against other cameras, because once you do that, then you can start honing in on what you like better and what suits your shooting needs. Instead of just versing the 6700 against one or two cameras, I actually versed it against 8 different cameras over the span of the last year, and I learned so much about this camera. I also shot a wedding with it. I used it as my BTS camera for my YouTube videos. I used it as a travel camera. I even shot a vlog style shot with Mark Bennett, Donna Did It, and Ben Johnson. So I've had quite the experience over the past year with this thing, and I thought it'd be a good time to just talk about it, my experience, so that way you can go out and make an informed decision if this is the camera that you decide to pick up. If you're new to the camera space, let me fill you in on what happened with the 6700. It first was released in July of 2023, and when it was released, there was a lot of hype surrounding it. But then that hype quickly died down because people were experiencing overheating, especially when you record longer takes like 4K 60 over 23 minutes. That's when it overheated for me, and that was at the highest image quality possible. But then instead of recording at the highest image quality possible, 422 10-bit, I drew it back to 420 10-bit, and I was still getting a really nice image quality, but also it wasn't overheating on me anymore. And if I ever wanted to shoot in that 422 10-bit, then I would have thrown the Lanzi cooling fan on the back of this camera, and that took care of my overheating issue. And it seems like the 6700 is now making a comeback from that initial overheating issue that most people were complaining about. So that's just a little introduction on the 6700 and how it made its headway into the camera space, and that's what we will be covering today on the Film Alliance. If by the end of this video you're still not sure if you want to pick up the Sony a6700, I made a free camera quiz that should put you on the right track and help you figure out what camera is right for you. I'll leave that quiz in the description. I mentioned that I versed this camera against 8 different cameras in the last 365 days. One of those cameras was the Sony a7C II, which is a full frame camera, so you're going to get better dynamic range, especially when you're in low light situations. The a7C II came out a month or two after the 6700, and I was always curious about why Sony did that, because I felt like the 6700 was taking off, and then they threw another camera into the mix, and it kind of stumped the 6700's growth. But again, this thing seems to be making a comeback. Another camera that I versed the 6700 against was the Sony a7C. Basically, that's just an updated Sony a7 III, but it can only shoot in 4K 30. It still doesn't get up to that 4K 60 like we were really hoping for. And that was one of the reasons why I chose the a6700 over the a7C, because it could shoot in 4K 60, actually it can shoot in 4K 120. And even though it's an APS-C sensor compared to that full frame sensor, I still preferred that higher frame rate and that higher resolution. And then I also compared it against the Sony a7 IV, which is also a full frame camera. The a7 IV can shoot in 4K 60, but with a crop. And if you're going to shoot in 4K 60 with a crop with a full frame camera, I said just go ahead and pick up the 6700. Also, those 3 full frame cameras were a lot more heavy and bulky than what I needed for my travel needs. I like to have small portable cameras that could fit right in my travel bag without having a huge form factor, and also the weight on those cameras can be pretty debilitating if you're doing a full day shoot somewhere, say like a wedding. The smaller form factor is a lot nicer. Recently, I compared the 6700 against the ZV-E10 Mark II, and one thing that I really loved about the 6700 over the ZV-E10 Mark II was the fact that it has an EVF. And this is super helpful when I find myself in bright environments, not only for photography, but also video. It helps me nail my focus better. Instead of just using the display on the ZV-E10 Mark II, sometimes that can be difficult to look and make sure that you're maintaining not only your right exposure, but also your focus, especially when you're outside, because the light reflects off of that glass display. I also versed the 6700 versus the FX30, which was definitely a step up from the 6700, but it was more expensive and it also had a bulkier body. The FX30 does come with an internal fan, so I wasn't having any of the overheating issues, and I didn't have to attach any extra accessories like the Ulanzi cooling fan to the body of the FX30, so that made it a lot nicer. But it did take up a little bit more room in my camera bag, and like I said, it's a little bit more expensive. In addition to that, I versed it against the Sony ZV-E10 Mark I because that is less expensive than the 6700, and it's also an APS-C sensor, but it can't shoot in the same frame rate and resolution as the 6700. And ultimately, I think the ZV-E10 Mark I is good if you are just planning on doing talking head shots like I'm doing right now in a controlled lighting environment, or if I'm out and I want to get some cinematic type shots, only shooting in 4K 24 and throwing that camera onto a gimbal. Whereas the 6700 didn't only have better stabilization, but I also found it to have a way better image quality because it could shoot in 10-bit, whereas the ZV-E10 Mark I could only shoot in 8-bit. One of my favorite comparisons was versing the A6700 versus the Fuji XS20. And the Fuji seemed to come out on top over the 6700 when it comes to image quality, but usability for me, because I'm a Sony guy and I only know Sony cameras, it only made sense for me to go with the 6700. And then finally, I versed it against the iPhone 15 Pro, which was a fun comparison to make, and it's shocking how good the iPhone can shoot. But ultimately, I had way more exposure control and focus control with the 6700, and because this thing does have a way bigger sensor than the iPhone, it's going to produce a better image quality in low light. So that's the cameras that I compared it to, and it's kind of the conclusions that I came up with. I'll leave all of those videos in the description if you want to go check out one of those particular comparisons. But when this 6700 came out, I was immediately impressed by its compact size, its weight, and I felt like it was the perfect fit for my travel bag. I took the 6700 with me on my first trip, and I was blown away by its performance. It has great autofocus, and it's even incredibly fast and accurate even in low light conditions, which is something that I didn't experience with my other cameras like the ZV-E10 Mark I. Because it's an 8-bit camera, it just was not that good in low light, unless I was manually exposing or maybe using a manual lens. It's definitely versatile in different lighting environments. I used this exact setup, the 6700 with the Viltrox 13mm f1.4 as a vlog cam, and I was loving the frame and the image quality. It was super sharp. I took the 6700 with me to Sony's condo trip, like I mentioned, and I did some vlog shots with some of my buddies, and I couldn't have asked for a better setup. It's small, easy, portable to use, and for me, I didn't have any overheating issues because I wasn't recording for longer periods of time. And I also used the 6700 to shoot a wedding. The camera's ability to track subjects accurately was essential for capturing that action, and also it has great low light performance. Also, the fact that compared to those full frame cameras that I versed it to, the lens compatibility was so much more beneficial because APS-C lenses are going to be cheaper than what you could get with full frame cameras. I've used all different types of lenses with the 6700. Most of the lenses that I used can communicate with the camera, so the autofocus system will work very well. And then I've also used manual lenses with this camera, and then in that case, I'm just stuck using the manual focus ring on the outside of the lens to get my focus. But regardless of that, I haven't had any issues with the lens not seating on the camera properly. And I've also used this camera as an overhead product shot camera, and I've been able to do some great product shots. That's important for people who might be doing YouTube videos like this and they are reviewing products. They're doing the overhead shot where you kind of show people what the product is in your hand, what it looks like. And then finally, I got some wildlife shots with this camera, and I think the best wildlife setup for the money is the A6700 with the 200 to 600. And if you get that 200 to 600, the camera itself is APS-C, so you're going to get that 1.5 times crop anyways, so it turns that 600 into 900. So if you're into wildlife photography or video, highly consider that setup. The A6700 has become my go-to B-cam for my Sony a7S III. So when I'm out shooting, I'll use my a7S III as my A-cam, maybe for my main client headshot camera, and then I'll use the 6700 off to the side, shooting in the same exact picture profile so that all of my colors match up, the skin tones match up, and it just makes a great B-cam. It's small, it's compact, and it's incredibly versatile. If you're looking for a hybrid camera that can handle anything you throw at it, I highly recommend the 6700 with the exception of live streaming. I think it will overheat if you live stream with this camera. So if you're into live streaming, go with a different camera. This camera for me is the one that I pretty much take with me anytime I walk out the door and I'm traveling and I need to get some BTS shots or behind the scenes shots. So that's my review of the Sony a6700 after using it for 1 year, what I like about it, what I didn't like about it, and most importantly, what you need to take away so that you can decide if you want to pick up this camera or not. Until the next video, I'm Joe with the Film Alliance.